welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'm just going to start by doing the housekeeping announcements and then introducing our speaker. So the housekeeping announcements are, if the fire alarm goes off, you can't use the lift. You have to go down the stairs, and we should congregate on the park side of the street, on the ground floor, where it was snowing just a moment ago, so I'm hoping that won't happen. And the second announcement is, please don't leave any valuables in our cloakrooms, because nobody is monitoring them. Great, so that's that done. Now, our speaker tonight is very well known to the Foundation, Dr. James Brown, because he's a former Daiwa scholar. And he's talking tonight about Japan's thorny relationship with Russia, and he has the expertise on both sides, since, of course, as a Daiwa scholar, he studied Japanese intensively in Tokyo on our scholarship program, but he also has a postgraduate diploma in Russian from the University of Glasgow. He has 2 master's degrees, one from Edinburgh, one from Aberdeen. Presumably there's a bachelor's in there somewhere. It's a Scottish. And a PhD in international relations from the University of Aberdeen, and has published widely in academic journals, particularly on, I think, Japan-Russian relations. So, over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Right, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you also to the Daiwa Foundation. Really, this book would not have been possible without the Daiwa Scholarship. My background, as Jason James was explaining, was very much to do with Russian foreign policy, and it was only thanks to the Daiwa Scholarship that I was able to build up my expertise on Japan as well. Anyway, the topic I'm talking about today is this book here. So it came out towards the end of March, and I've been very lucky with the timing. I think sometimes people can be very unlucky with the timing of their books, but in this case, it's a particularly interesting time at the moment for Russia-Japan relations. As many of you will know, on the 6th of May, we're expecting Prime Minister Abe to travel to Sochi for an unofficial summit with President Putin. So one of the main topics they'll be talking about is the absence of a peace treaty between the two sides, and also this territorial dispute. So hopefully I can provide a little bit of background to this topic and explain what some of the thorny issues are here. Okay, so I think it's a very knowledgeable audience I was having a look through, and I imagine many of you will know the background to this issue, but clearly we're focused. I don't have a pointer, do I? Maybe there's something here, sorry. Okay, so clearly we're talking about this area here. But to go into a little bit more detail, it's the 4-island dispute. Now, it's not actually 4 islands, it's 3 islands and a group of islets. And they're not actually that small. I think that sometimes people can imagine that we're talking about very small amounts of land. Actually, it's really quite significant. The largest of the islands you can see there, 3,280 kilometers squared. Now, if that was returned to Japanese administration, that would actually be the 5th largest of the Japanese islands, after the 4 main islands. And you can see also the comparison there with the Senkaku dispute, where it's only over 6 kilometers squared. So we're talking about significant amounts of territory. A few other details here, just the names. In Russian on the left-hand side, Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and Habomai. And in Japanese, Eterofu, Kunashiri, and then the same for the other 2. As for the photo, I include this in particular because it relates to Daiwa. The Daiwa scholarship involves a homestay. And you get to essentially choose where in Japan you're going to spend this month. And given my background in Russian foreign policy, which was the topic of my PhD, I chose to do it as close to Russia as possible. So this is Nemuro in Hokkaido, the northeastern tip of Hokkaido. And the photo here, you probably can't make it out, but there's a sort of brown or kind of dark smudge in the background, which is actually Habomai. And so I spent my month there asking the locals for their opinion on the territorial dispute. I had the opportunity to speak to some of the former residents of the islands, and that really helped to give me a background and an understanding of the Japanese side of this argument. Okay, so that's the basic geographical details. Onto the historical background, and this is crucial to understanding the nature of this dispute. I spent quite a lot of time talking about this in the book, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'll skip over this relatively quickly. The key thing to focus on to begin with is when diplomatic relations were established between Japan and Russia. That was with the Treaty of Shimoda in 1855. And this is significant because it was at this point that, for the first time, the international border was established between the two countries. And that put it here, placing the 4 islands, which are now disputed, firmly within Japanese territory. So from the Japanese government's perspective, this is deeply important. This was an agreement which was made voluntarily by the two sides, and the two governments at that time decided that these 4 islands were part of Japan. Subsequent to this as well, the islands remained with Japan. In 1875, with the Treaty of St. Petersburg, some further issues to do with the border were worked out. Because with the 1855 agreement, whilst the border was established with the Kuril chain, it didn't finalize the status of Sakhalin. That was only achieved with the 1875 Treaty of St. Petersburg, where Sakhalin was recognized as being Russian territory, and in exchange, the full Kuril chain leading right up to Kamchatka was passed to Japan. So this, another agreement between the two sides, and yet still the 4 islands remain with Japan. And then the final treaty mentioned here, Treaty of Portsmouth, this after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, and this is the maximum extent of Japan's territorial possessions vis-à-vis Russia, because southern Sakhalin goes to Japan as well, and the Kuril chain remains with Japan. So all through this period, the 4 islands, which are now disputed, firmly on the Japanese side. This all changes, of course, with World War II. And as I'm sure you'll all know, during this conflict, for the majority of the time, Japan and Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, are not enemies. They're not fighting each other because of the Neutrality Pact, which was signed between the two of them in April 1941, which says very clearly that in the event of the parties getting involved in a conflict, the two sides, Soviet Union and Japan, will remain neutral for the duration of the conflict. However, this ended in 1945, and on the evening of the 8th of August 1945, Soviet Union declared war on Japan. A few hours later, launching offensives in Manchuria, Sakhalin, and eventually occupying the full Kuril chain, including the 4 disputed islands, towards the end of that month. So this is significant, of course, because the occupation of the 4 islands taking place after Japan had announced its intention to surrender, and indeed the final occupation of Habomai taking place after the instrument of surrender had been signed at the beginning of September. Other historical things of importance: the San Francisco Treaty of 1951, when Japan renounced all right, title and claim to the Kuril Islands. So you might think that this, in a way, would settle the dispute in Japan, saying that it was giving up its claim to the islands. However, Soviet Union didn't sign the peace treaty, and further to that, the peace treaty provided no definition of what actually the Kuril Islands were, meaning that subsequent to that, the Japanese government would say that the Kuril Islands refers to the islands north of the 4 disputed ones, not including all of them down to Hokkaido. So this means that there remains to this day no peace treaty between the two sides. However, it's sometimes suggested in articles that this means that the two countries are still at war, are still in a state of war. That's not correct, because in the Joint Declaration of 1956, it said very clearly that the two sides were agreeing to put an end to the state of war, but postponing for the time being the issue of actually signing a peace treaty. But this is a very, very important agreement. In fact, it was ratified by the legislatures of both sides, meaning that it actually has the status of an international treaty. And that's very important because within that agreement, it sets out a potential deal for solving this long-standing dispute. Because the Soviet side in that agreement said that they would be willing to transfer the two smaller of the islands after the signing of a peace treaty. And the Russian government to this day has stood by this. The Putin administration has said that this is a legal agreement, it was ratified by both sides, and they are willing to uphold it. Okay, so that's the historical background. On to essentially what Japan's position is. So the Japanese government takes the view, this is on the website of MOFA, of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, saying that these islands are inherent Japanese territory. They were clearly recognized as being Japanese in the 1855 Treaty of Shimoda, but even prior to this, it's argued that they were essentially inherent Japanese territory. They also make the point that the occupation of these islands was opportunistic and illegal. Illegal because it was seen as being in violation of the Neutrality Pact of 1941, and also because there is the view that the Soviet Union's contribution to the war and the victory over Japan was entirely marginal. The narrative is that Japan was already essentially defeated, and the Soviet Union came in at the end essentially just to opportunistically seize territory. Some Japanese academics have described it as the Soviet Union acting like a thief at a fire, or stabbing Japan in the back. And the Japanese government says that they are flexible on how to solve this issue, but essentially that the 1956 proposal is insufficient. The two islands only represent 7% of the total, and they want more than that. So, it's not settled exactly what the Japanese government would agree to, but many on the Japanese side have come up with proposals as to what actually could be a viable deal. Most often in the past, the suggestion has been from Japanese administrations that they would like 4 islands as a batch. The Russian side acknowledging Japanese sovereignty over all 4 of the islands at once. Others, however, have suggested a slightly more moderate position, suggesting that there could be perhaps a 50-50 split. That would mean that there would be a new international border about here on Eterofu. And that's because Eterofu is so much larger than the other islands. That would actually be 50-50. Others have said that perhaps Eterofu, Iterup could remain with Russia, and these 3 islands could be returned. And others have said that, in fact, the potential solution could be that Japan, first of all, gets these 2 islands back, and then continues to negotiate and has some sort of additional agreement on these. And so, kind of differences on the Japanese side as to what the potential solution could be, but all of them agree that the 1956 agreement is insufficient. Okay, now to bring this up to the present day, many Japanese prime ministers have been interested in solving this problem. But I think that Prime Minister Abe is really quite unusual in the amount of attention that he has given to relations with Russia. Ever since his return to power in December 2012, one of the priorities of his foreign policy has been building closer relations with Russia. He made this clear from the very beginning. On the day of his election, or rather the LDP's return to power, he spoke about the importance of relations with Russia. He followed this up by visiting Moscow in April 2013, and that was the first visit by a Japanese prime minister in over 10 years. And subsequent to this, whenever it has been possible, he's looked to build closer relations with Russia. And there are a few reasons for this. But one of the main ones is the hope from Prime Minister Abe that he can be the one to perhaps see a breakthrough in this territorial dispute before he leaves office. And as I say, he's been working on this since he came to power, but it seems that he believes that 2016 could potentially be the year. He's already had some foreign policy successes. Towards the end of 2015, he signed the agreement with South Korea, potentially settling the sensitive comfort women issue. And it seems that with that, in a way, out the way, his new focus for 2016 is on relations with Russia. And he's made no secret of this. Since the very beginning of the year, he's spoken about the need to achieve something on the territorial dispute. In his media appearance, at the beginning of January, his first media appearance, he spoke about his intention to hold a summit with Russia. He followed this up in a press interview held with the Financial Times and the Nikkei. And also there have been a number of different visits from prominent members of the LDP, including Mr. Komura, that was in January, handing over a personal letter from Prime Minister Abe, and also, quite interestingly, talking about the potential for Japan to act as a bridge between the G7 and Russia, and potentially for Japan in a way to represent Russia's interests within the G7. Now clearly this buttering up of the Russian side is intended to make it possible to make progress on the territorial dispute. Been phone calls between the two leaders, and also very interesting development, this one you can see noted 22nd of January, the appointment of a special representative for relations with Russia. And this is Mr. Harada Chikahito, a former Japanese ambassador to Moscow, very knowledgeable about Russia. And it's very unusual to have this position of a special representative. And it's clearly been created explicitly because Mr. Abe believes that this year can be when a breakthrough can be achieved. A few other interesting developments, but to highlight just the final two, a few days ago, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov traveled to Tokyo, held a meeting on the 15th of April with his counterpart, Mr. Kishida. Actually, after that meeting, I met with some Russian diplomats in Tokyo, and they were able to fill me in on some of the details. So perhaps later on, if you're interested, I can speak a bit about that. But all of this was leading up to this meeting scheduled for the 6th of May, when there's going to be an informal summit held in Sochi between the two leaders. Now you might ask, why is this an informal summit rather than a formal one? The reason being is because it's supposed to be President Putin's turn to go to Japan. He's been invited, but the two sides have been unable to agree on a concrete date for that. And the reason is because of Japan's introduction of sanctions against Russia because of the crisis in Ukraine. So that meant that they weren't bold enough, the Japanese side, to actually settle a date for Putin's visit, but they didn't want to give up on this progress that had been made in relations since 2012. So what they did is they agreed that instead Abe would go to Russia. But it couldn't be an official summit because that would disturb the protocol. Instead, they agreed to make it an informal summit and not in the capital. So that's why they're meeting in Sochi. In a way, however, it suits their interests that it's an informal summit because it means that there is less pressure on them to actually have a formal declaration at the end, and they don't need to necessarily reveal so much information about what's discussed. So, from the Japanese side, it's seen as an opportunity to actually try and have intensive discussions one-to-one and try and make some progress on the territorial dispute. And it seems to me that Prime Minister Abe is particularly optimistic about what can be achieved. there's the strong belief that Japan has a secure position when it comes to historical and legal issues, some of the issues that I mentioned earlier on. There's also the belief that Japan has a certain degree of leverage over Russia. When you read articles from Japanese academics, they often come back to the issue of Russia needing Japan's help in order to develop Siberia and the Far East, which is a major priority of the Putin administration. They really want to improve the economic conditions of the east of their country. And the Japanese side thinks that maybe this could be a source of leverage. In addition to this, it's often mentioned that despite the superficially excellent relations between Russia and China, there's the belief that underneath that, there are serious concerns from the Russian side about China's growth and its increasing assertiveness. So this leads to the belief that maybe that can also be an incentive for the Russian side to build closer relations with Japan and perhaps compromise on the territorial issue. And other issues as well. Prime Minister Abe seems to have quite strong self-belief about what he can achieve in terms of foreign policy. He's had some relative success. I already mentioned the deal with South Korea, and it seems to be that he feels that he has a real chance. It's often mentioned the belief that he has a relationship of trust and understanding with President Putin, and therefore in a one-to-one negotiation, maybe he could persuade the Russian leader of the merits of compromise. And in addition to that, there are some who believe that Japan still has a decent chance because of Mr. Putin. Putin's predecessor, Dmitry Medvedev, is seen as being much more kind of anti-Japanese than Putin. Sometimes people point to Putin's interest in judo, also the fact that his daughter studied Japanese at university, and they add this up to the idea that perhaps Putin is more pro-Japanese and might be more inclined to compromise. There's also been a degree of encouragement from the Russian side, in that Putin has made a few comments talking about the potential for a hikiwake, a draw between the two sides, which some interpreted to mean that maybe he would agree to, say, a 50-50 territorial split over these 4 islands. And more recently, he also, as part of his Priamaya Linia, direct line phone-in that perhaps you heard about, after that, in a press conference, when asked about relations with Japan and the territorial dispute, he said that he believed that a compromise can and will be found. Okay, so it does seem like there are some potential sources for optimism. But what my aim was to achieve in the book was to see whether there were any genuine prospects for success, and in particular to focus on the Russian side and to look at how the Russian public and Russian politicians see this issue, to see whether there genuinely could be a compromise. And to essentially jump ahead to what my conclusion of that is, the prospects of Japan securing a favourable deal for the 4 islands, or even 3, is essentially 0. There might be a possibility of 2 islands, the 2 smaller ones, but as I went through this topic in great detail, I found no indications whatsoever that the Russian side could ever be induced to compromise and actually give up any sovereignty over the 2 larger islands, Kunashir and Iteruk. And this is essentially because any settlement that would see Japan secure more than the 2 small islands is dependent on Russia voluntarily giving up that territory. So for that to happen, there would need to be much stronger leverage over Russia, and I don't think that that exists. Okay, so I don't want to talk for too long. I've got about another 10 minutes. So in that remaining time, I'm going to run through briefly the Russian view of this territorial dispute, talking about their views on history, in particular the Second World War, about their views on economic or so-called economic incentives or leverage, about security, and also a little bit about public opinion. Now, I'll go relatively quickly through this, but I'm happy to discuss it afterwards with the questions. So first of all, how the Russian side sees these issues of history and law. Well, to begin with, there's no view that this is actually inherent Japanese territory. You read what Russian historians write, and they very much argue that in actual fact, this was not Japanese territory. This was territory which was gradually being squeezed between two empires, two expanding empires that was originally the land of the Ainu. So instead of being inherent Japanese land, the argument is made from Russian historians, not my argument, but they make the claim that this was actually land that was fairly recently colonized by Japan. You can see this is a quotation from a quite well-known Russian historian, Koshkin, saying the fact of the matter is that Japanese advance onto the Kuril Islands constituted the seizure of territory and was accompanied by the same annihilation of local tribes that occurred in America with the Indians. So clearly, if on the Russian side this view is quite widely held, there's less likelihood that they would be sympathetic to the view that this is historic, inherent Japanese territory. Other issues. Rather than the violation of the Neutrality Pact being a stab in the back, instead the Russian view is that really the two sides had been essentially adversaries for the entire period of the first half of the 20th century. And Russian historians point to not just the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, but to other events as well. The Siberian intervention, when Japanese forces intervened in the Russian Far East during the Russian Civil War, the anti-Comintern Pact that was clearly directed against the Soviet Union, the rather quite small battle of Lake Khasan, and the much larger Khalkhin Gol, when the Japanese Empire looked to perhaps consider further expanding its territory into the Soviet Union or the Soviet satellite of Mongolia. In those battles, the Japanese forces were defeated. The broader point here is that according to the Russian view, this pact was nothing more than a temporary matter of convenience for both sides, and that the Japanese side itself knew that essentially the two sides were adversaries and that they had considered breaking the pact themselves when they were in a stronger position later in 1941, at the time when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. They also point to the fact that rather than the Soviet Union simply attacking Japan without any warning, it was rather the case that Moscow renounced the pact in April 1945, a few months before declaring war. So again, making the point that it was clear that the two sides were adversaries. Important other points as well is the claim that the Soviet Union's entry into the war was to uphold a solemn promise to the other allies, a promise that was made at Yalta. And at Yalta, the meeting between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, it was made very clear that the Kuril Islands shall be handed over to the Soviet Union. And this was seen as a sort of reward, compensation for the Soviet Union's entry into the war. Now, the Japanese side says that this is not binding. This is an illegal kind of international treaty. Japan did not sign, clearly, the Yalta Protocol, but from the Soviet Union and the Russian point of view, this clearly indicates that they had a right to occupy this territory. Russian side is also very dismissive of claims that the four islands are not part of the Kuril chain. You recall that I mentioned that the Kuril chain was renounced by Japan in the San Francisco Treaty. Japan claims that it doesn't include the four islands. The Russian side says that is nonsense. The so-called Northern Territories, the term which the Japanese government uses to refer to the islands to differentiate them from the Kuril chain, the Russian side thinks that that's just a made-up term that came later to justify Japan's position. And finally, on these perceptions of history and law, and indeed perhaps the most important one, is to do with memories of the Second World War more generally. When I've been in Russia and I've asked people their view as to whether Russia would ever return this territory, the main reason I've been given for why it wouldn't happen is because it would be seen as a betrayal of Soviet troops who lost their lives fighting the Japanese. And further to that, there's the view that this fighting was not meaningless. It wasn't simply the Soviet Union intervening to try and seize territory. There is the view that the Soviet Union actually made the crucial contribution to winning the war against Japan. You can see this from the quotation there from Sergei Mironov, who's an opposition politician, the head of Spravedlivaya Rossiya, a Just Russia party. And he says it is a historical fact that the Soviet victory over Japan led to the end of World War II. They're very, very different from the view in the West and also within Japan, where it would be clearly mentioned the Pacific War, also the atomic attacks against Japan. But within Russia, much more common to believe that it was the Soviet Union's contribution that brought the war to an end. Now, in total, it was about 12,000 Soviet troops that were killed fighting the Japanese. None of those were killed actually seizing the 4 disputed islands. Most of them lost their lives in Manchuria or on Sakhalin. There were a few who were killed at the Battle of Shumshu at the very northern end of the Kuril chain, sometimes referred to as the last battle of World War II. But the 4 islands themselves were not seized in that way. That doesn't stop many on the Russian side, however, seeing those islands as being, well, it's better to use the words of Dmitry Rogozin, a Russian deputy prime minister, saying the 4 islands became Russian territory after a bloody struggle and have now assumed the status of sacred territory. So again, it doesn't matter quite so much what the truth of this matter is, it matters what the Russian perceptions are. Because in order for this to be solved in Japan's favor, the Russian side needs to be persuaded to voluntarily give up this territory. And what is increasingly clear is that those conditions are not in place. Okay, so that's the history and law. And there is also the view that whilst the Russian side would rather like Japanese economic investment in the far east of the country, they don't believe that there is such a strong incentive in order to compromise on the territorial dispute in order to receive it. They believe that they have some counter leverage over Japan, primarily because of oil and gas, but they also are not particularly impressed by the state of the Japanese economy. I've read some Russian economists saying that Japan, in its current economic situation, is similar to a country after a long and debilitating war. And so their view is that this isn't a country that you would be desperate to make political concessions to in order to get economic investment. It's rather a declining country, in their view. And similarly, you have the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, saying that he doesn't actually believe that the territorial dispute is preventing Japanese companies from investing in Russia. He said this in January 2016, saying that he doesn't feel that Japanese businesses are playing it safe, that essentially saying that the absence of a peace treaty is not really that much of an obstacle. They believe that if they get their economic conditions right, if they make the Russian Far East a more attractive place for investment, Japanese businesses will come and invest irrespective of the absence of a peace treaty. Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so I'll just skip over a final few points. This one is to do with economic value of the islands, reluctance to give them up, especially because they've been investing a great deal in them over the last few years. Not only on the larger islands, but also on the island of Shikotan, which under the 1956 agreement, they're supposed to transfer to Japan after the signing of a peace treaty. But they've been building new infrastructure. This is a new clinic that they've just built there. And clearly, if you've just invested a lot in building your infrastructure, you're less likely to want to give it up. And I'll just finish off by talking a little bit about security issues. You'll recall that a potential source of leverage was seen as being Russia's concern about China. The Russian elite, however, don't seem to be that worried. Now, of course, they would say that they're not actually worried about China, but I think that there's some real truth to this, because the Russian elite's major concern is staying in power. The Chinese government doesn't have an interest in toppling the Putin administration. They're not interested in stirring up democratic movements within the country. And so even if there might be some concern about a powerful China exerting its weight within the Asia Pacific, that's not really seen as a major concern for the Russian leadership. So, quotation from Putin saying that they're not worried about the China threat, and I'm inclined to believe that. After all, the main interest that China has in the Russian Far East is Russia's resources. Some people have suggested that that might lead at some point to China looking to seize those resources. But why would they, when the Russian side is so willing to sell them to China anyway? Okay, now I think I should probably stop there. I was going to also mention that within Russia, the Ukraine crisis in the introduction of sanctions has soured views towards Japan, not necessarily with Putin himself, but with lower level politicians. This was a quotation from Mr. Kalashnikov, Duma deputy, saying that essentially he now considers Japan to be an adversary or even an enemy of Russia. And clearly, that's going to make it much more difficult for any Russian leader to try and compromise with Japan. Now, I will stop there. I do have some other things that I could have mentioned, but I think you've got a clear idea of what my conclusion is, which is essentially that Prime Minister Abe, who has risked quite a lot with his Russia policy, he has gone against the United States. The US has warned Abe, there was a phone call earlier this year, suggesting that the US side really felt that this was not a good idea to be going soft on Russia at this time. And as you'll know, usually Japan goes along quite closely with what the United States wishes. Close ally. On this, however, Abe has created some distance between the United States. But I think that this isn't going to pay off, because, as I've been explaining, he's not going to get a territorial deal. And at least as I see it, President Putin, to a degree, has been leading the Japanese side on, encouraging the belief that maybe some advantageous deal could be struck, but I don't think that's the case. I think the maximum that the Japanese side could expect is the 1956 agreement on the two smaller islands. Anything further than that is just not possible. Indeed, it's a delusion. Okay, I'll stop there.